If you want to know what God thinks about money, look at the people he gave it to. Human history is full of those who had everything and still lost themselves. But rarely does someone build a powerful empire from dust with their own hands, only to burn it to ashes at the peak of its glory. Jordan Belfort was one such case. At an age when many were still struggling to pay off student loans, he owned a mansion like a castle, a yacht the size of a battleship, a private jet, and an army of hundreds of brokers manipulating the market like an underground financial empire. He didn't invent, didn't produce, didn't create value in the classical sense. What he sold was a packaged dream, made legitimate on paper but hollow at its core. And the most terrifying thing was, it worked for a while. You might think you'd never do what he did. You might believe you're immune to greed, to a life of indulgence, to the moral decay that money can buy. But if you grew up in a system where every value, from ethics to intelligence, could be measured by a spreadsheet, and where lies were praised as optimizing sales strategy, then the question is no longer whether you will fall, but how long you will hold on to yourself before you begin to redefine right and wrong according to personal gain. Wall Street doesn't apologize, doesn't preach morality, and doesn't pretend to regret to buy sympathy. This book is the birth certificate and death warrant of an individual nurtured by the system that Wall Street and American capitalism produced, where success is measured not by the quality of work, but by the thickness of a bank account and the resonance of a name in the speculative world. What gives this story its allure isn't the money earned, but the raw honesty it dares to expose. A man who went to the extreme limits of desire, exploiting every loophole in the system to manipulate, escape, erode others, and finally, himself. So, what is this after all? A warning, a confession, or a disguised success manual? The answer, if there is one, isn't found on every page. It lies in your reaction when you read the last line. Do you feel outraged, empathetic, or worse, admiring? The genesis of Madness Asterisk. The day I walked into the office of Stratton Man, a company named like royalty, but built by a kid who used to sell fish and had gone bankrupt. That day, I, Jordan Belfort, officially became the boss. No longer a gold-digging broker on Wall Street, but the one who drew up my own rules. In my mind, there was only one thing: penny stocks. Junk stocks that mainstream stockbrokers wouldn't even bother to mention because they were worthless. But to me, they were treasure. I used to make calls like a madman to sell them. Stocks from companies that sounded like barbershops or crazy gas stations, and I'd earn up to 50% commission. Yes, 50%. No product needed, no real revenue, just sweet words and a victim with money. But I wanted more. I wanted to escalate the scam to the truly wealthy, not the blue-collar workers who just got their pension, but the doctors in upscale neighborhoods, the lawyers sitting on piles of inherited assets. I wanted to sell trash to people who thought they were immune to scams, and I did it. I assembled a group of young guys, knew nothing about the market but had a natural talent. No shame in lying. That's how Stratton was born. No flashy signs, no proper registration, just a phone, a list of numbers, and a pile of worthless stocks. I taught them how to use their voices to make people believe they were about to miss out on a financial revolution. No degree needed, no knowledge, just keep your mouth moving faster than the client's brain. I set up the office in Luke, a name that sounded ironic. A dreary gray concrete building, a parking lot for garbage trucks, but inside it was a gold forge. With every successful call, a bell rang like a cash register. I encouraged them to yell, pound tables, jump around like lunatics when they closed a deal. The atmosphere was always like a mass psychosis, and I sat above, looking down, not with pride, but with a twisted amusement. Because I knew I had just replicated myself hundreds of times over. Everything started with a few cold calls, as stockbrokers called them. I wrote out scripts for every single breath. I told my staff to read them as if they were singing a hymn. Don't be creative, don't think. Just believe that if you follow every line correctly, the person on the other end won't be able to say no. I remember a young employee named Janny, a kid with pimples and a reedy voice like a drake. I threw him a stack of old client leads and told him to call. He stammered and couldn't get a sentence out. I snatched the phone and made a sample call. In just 5 minutes, I convinced a bald lawyer in Boston to drop $10,000 on shares of a company that made banana peelers. No joke. After that call, Janny looked at me like I was a living saint. Months later, he became one of Stratton's top earners. snorting coke like it was water and buying yachts even though he couldn't swim. When money started pouring in like a waterfall, I moved the office upstairs, rented more space, installed red carpets, walnut desks, and leather chairs imported from Italy. I bought a large bronze bell and hung it in the hall. Anyone who closed a deal for $100,000 or more got to ring it once. Every time it rang, the office erupted as if someone had won the lottery. The new recruits looked at the bell as a symbol of power. I didn't tell them, it was salvaged from a demolished church in Brooklyn. I also started recruiting more people, not in the way corporations do. I went to gyms, bars, night markets. I looked for those with wild eyes and desperation in their voices. I asked one question: are you afraid to call strangers? If the answer was no, I hired them. I believed skills could be taught, but shamelessness was innate. There was a guy I recruited from a bar in Queens named Chester, a former serviceman, nearly 2 meters tall, muscular like a stone statue, and reeking of cheap whiskey. I distinctly remember him walking into the interview room, eyes direct, shoulders straight, but his voice trembling as if he were about to shatter. I didn't need to ask much, just said, "Can you make people believe it's raining even when the sun is shining?" He nodded. I said, "Good, start tomorrow." A month later, Chester closed $1 million deal, not because he was smart, but because he was shameless. When clients refused, he wouldn't hang up. He kept talking, telling them his wife had cancer, his kids were starving, begging for a chance. The clients, softened, wired the money. The stock he sold, as usual, was worthless. I didn't ask if he really had a wife and kids, I just said, "Well done." The culture at Stratton was unlike any company that had ever existed. I called it Gold Rush 2. Everything was pushed to the extreme: music, drugs, sex, money. I allowed employees to smoke weed on site as long as they didn't spill coffee on clients' desks. They gave each other nicknames like in a Mad Max gang: Boney Lyric, Crazy Mike. Every morning walking into the office was a parade. Blazing orange shirts, shiny white leather shoes, oversized watches. I encouraged them to show off. The bigger the display, the more they impressed outsiders, the easier it was to trick clients into believing they knew what they were doing. Every weekend, I hired buses to take the whole office to strip clubs. I paid for drinks, paid for the girls. I wanted them to get addicted to the feeling of being king, so that when they returned to their desks on Monday, they would sell their souls just to maintain that status. I knew if I could link their self-esteem to sales, I'd have an army that couldn't stop selling. But real money didn't come from penny stocks. It came when I discovered a bigger loophole: companies preparing for an IPO, an initial public offering. I could buy shares in advance for a few cents, then use my team of brokers to pressure clients into buying them back for 10 times the price. It was a dirty game but legal, at least on paper. I just needed to concoct a story. The company was about to sign a contract with the military, or invent new technology, or a major investor had just poured in capital. Clients had no way to verify. We held the megaphone, and our voices were loud enough to drown out any doubts. Once, I pushed a company that made razors onto the market, claiming they were about to sign an exclusive deal with the largest supermarket chain in America. The stock surged 300% in one day. My associates and I raked in millions. 3 months later, that company went bankrupt. But by then, we had moved on to the next venture. The game wasn't about holding, it was about getting out. Buy junk, paint it pretty, resell it, run, repeat. But this game required a team behind the scenes, people who owned the majority of the shares but under different names. I called them straw buyers, or rats. These were people completely unrelated to the company, but who held shares on our behalf. When the stock price went up, we sold through these straw buyers, then transferred the money back to accounts in Switzerland or the Cayman Islands. Everything seemed to run smoothly until I started to believe I was invincible. One day, I was in the boardroom, presenting a hyperbolic growth plan to the brokers. I drew a spiral model on the whiteboard, starting from cold calls to consulting to closing deals, then back to expanding the client list. I told them everyone here was a value creator. No one on Wall Street did this better than us. The crowd applauded wildly. But in my head, I knew the only value we created was illusory. Clients thought they were investing. In reality, they were paying for the illusion of getting rich. That feeling, knowing I was staging a play but performing it as if it were real, became familiar. I no longer felt guilt. I felt excitement. I was like a director orchestrating a massive con where everyone involved believed they were playing for real. only I knew it was a stage. Every morning, I walked into the office as if stepping onto a grand stage, where I was the lead actor, director, and producer all at once. I wore a Brioni suit, alligator shoes, sunglasses even when the sky was clear. I wanted everyone to look at me and think, that's what success looks like. But I knew my success was built from layers of illusion, mortar mixed with lies, and painted over with greed. Outwardly, I talked about strategy, growth, investment opportunities. Inside, I cared about only one thing: how much money would flow into my personal account today. I gradually lost the ability to distinguish between performance and reality. Once, I stood on a podium speaking to 300 brokers, shouting, "We don't just sell stocks, we sell dreams. And whoever paints dreams best will make the most money." The crowd rose, applauding thunderously. I stood there, arms raised, feeling empty. Money came too fast, too quickly. I started not knowing what to do with it. I bought a mansion in Long Island, a house the size of an elementary school. I drove a Ferrari, then got bored and switched to a Lamborghini. I hired divers to build a shark tank in my bathroom. I bought a helicopter, then bought a private jet to avoid airport traffic. Every time I felt sad, I bought something to cover it up. But the sadness didn't disappear, it just changed form. I also started spending money on drugs. Not aspirin, I'm talking about Quaaludes. One small pill and the world slowed down like a slow-mo movie. Everything became soft, light, without consequences. I drank alcohol, smoked weed, chewed sleeping pills, then snorted coke to wake up. I played a tightrope game with my nervous system, bright like the sun in the morning, crashing down like a stone at night. One night, I drove home from Manhattan. I don't remember what I drank, but my hands trembled like leaves, my eyes could barely stay open. I fell asleep at the wheel, woke up, and my car was in my neighbor's lawn, the front end embedded in the fence. I wasn't hurt, I just thought, lucky I didn't die. But the real question was, why didn't I die and why didn't I feel scared? My wife at the time was Nadine, a woman beautiful as a wax figure, who used to model for beer commercials. She was young, vibrant, and smarter than she let on. When I met Nadine, I was married to my first wife, Dennis, who had been with me since I sold seafood door to door. I told Dennis I needed freedom. In truth, I wanted someone more beautiful, someone who fit the image of the Wall Street wolf I was becoming. Nadine brought me into a new world: high fashion, elite parties, conversations where no one spoke the truth. But she was also the first person who dared to look me straight in the eye and say, "You're destroying yourself." I laughed and turned away. I didn't know that a few years later, those very words would haunt me in an FBI interrogation room. But at that time, I didn't see an end, I only saw the peak. I built an empire no one understood, not even myself. Stratton became a money-printing machine. Every month, we pulled in tens of millions of dollars. Clients came from everywhere: California, Texas, Florida, Canada, UAE. Some bought real stocks, some were pressured into buying junk. I didn't differentiate, money was money. Then the media started paying attention. Forbes, the Bible of the financial world, wrote an article about me. The title? The Wolf of Wall Street. I read it and laughed out loud. I told everyone I was insulted, but deep down I loved it. That name, Wolf of Wall Street, was both dangerous and legendary. It made me an icon, and I used it to recruit hundreds more employees. I started organizing training sessions like stage shows. I stood on the podium, lights shining directly on my face, microphone in hand like a rock star. I yelled, "Who here wants to get rich?" The response was like an earthquake. I pointed at each person. "You'll get rich, you too, but if you're lazy, you'll die poor." I didn't teach finance. I taught how to make others afraid to say no. It became a cult. I was the guru, money was the deity. Once, I took the entire office on vacation to the Bahamas. Not a real vacation, but an excuse to party. I rented an entire resort, set up a stage, invited DJs from Miami. Each room got 2 bottles of vodka, a bag of drugs, and a list of girls they could call when lonely. For 3 days, we turned paradise into a glorious hell. Some passed out in the pool, some were bitten by iguanas, some couples were caught having sex behind the bar. I didn't care, as long as on Monday they returned to the office with a craving for money even stronger than their craving for drugs. It was also in the Bahamas that I was knocked down by a Quaalude overdose right in the middle of a party. I lay flat on the sand, looking at the sky, my head spinning like a roller coaster. Someone asked if I was okay. I burst out laughing. "Okay? I'm just flying in a bull market." The crowd roared with laughter. I lay there, mind blank, thinking, if I die right now, it would be worth it. But I didn't die. I lived, and I continued to build my tower of illusions even higher. When money comes too fast, you lose your sense of value. I once paid $1 million for a painting made of horsehair. I didn't like it, I just bought it because others wanted to buy it too. I paid $50,000 for a bottle of wine, took a sip, and spat it into the sink. I bought a lion to put in my backyard. Neighbors called the police. I said it was an African dog and showed fake vaccination papers. All limits could be stretched as long as you had money, and I did. I hired 3 lawyers to ensure I was never caught. I told them, your job isn't to protect me from court. Your job is to keep me from ever stepping foot in one. They nodded. Every month I paid them 6 figures. Every call I used coded words. Buy watermelons meant push stocks. Deliver pizza meant launder money. We left no traces, or so we thought. But I knew every empire of deceit eventually gets discovered, and I started seeing the first cracks. Once a client sued because he lost all his money. I told my lawyers to handle it. A few weeks later, the client dropped the lawsuit. I didn't ask why, but I knew we had ways to silence people. Sometimes it was money, sometimes it was threats, sometimes both. But then there were those who wouldn't stay silent. The FBI started sending letters. The SEC called. An auditor quit halfway through and sent an anonymous letter to the Treasury Department. I still laughed. I told my staff, we're too big to fail. That phrase I borrowed from a major bank, and like them, I thought I was invincible. Once I attended a meeting with a group of lawyers in Manhattan. I went with 5 bodyguards, each as big as a refrigerator. I walked into the room like a president, sat down, crossed my legs, and smiled. What do you want? Proof. I sell stocks, legally. They didn't smile. One person handed me a recording, my voice clearly directing the manipulation of stock prices. I took a sip of water, smiled. That's fake. But in my head, the bell had rung. I started seeing the shadow of the FBI everywhere. I hired anti-surveillance experts. I demanded employees not use landlines. I moved money offshore through banking systems in Switzerland, the Cayman Islands, Lebanon. I used other people's names. I set up shell companies. I laundered money through real estate transactions, buying paintings, renting private jets, and then, not flying. Every night, I slept with a gun under my pillow. I told my wife it was just for protection. In reality, I was scared. Not afraid of being killed, but afraid of being caught, afraid of being pulled out of the game before I could drain it dry. But I knew I couldn't run forever. The day I truly realized the empire was collapsing was when an employee, a kid who had only been there 6 months, refused an order I gave him. I told him to push a stock that was about to be delisted. He said, I don't want to scam people. I burst out laughing and told him, you've been scamming people since the day you walked into this office. He took off his employee badge, threw it on the desk, and walked out. I sat there in silence. Not because I regretted losing him, but because for the first time, I saw a look in someone's eyes that made me feel ashamed. The dark game begins. The first sign wasn't a siren, not a knock at the door in the middle of the night or the click of handcuffs. It came from an ambiguous feeling, as if someone was standing in the corner of the room watching me, but never showing their face. I saw it in the eyes of a few employees, in the prolonged silence after a meeting, in the way brokers started whispering to each other, wondering if they were being watched. By then, Stratton was too big, too exposed, too obvious. I knew it, but I could no longer control the monster I created. Millions of dollars poured into the office every day. But the problem was, too much money needed unconventional pathways to exist. So I created shell companies, registered in the Cayman Islands, Panama, Switzerland. They produced nothing, sold nothing. They only existed to move money back and forth without leaving a trace. One account sent, one account received. Between them was an invisible company, registered under the name of an old banana farmer in Costa Rica. A flow of money disappeared and reappeared elsewhere, clean as if it had just been to a spa. But money couldn't just float on its own, it needed carriers. So I created a network of straw buyers, individuals who held stocks, accounts, and contracts on our behalf. We hired them from everywhere, ex-girlfriends, taxi drivers, an old aunt in Brooklyn. Each person only held a few % of the shares, not enough to raise suspicion. But combined, they held almost all the stocks we manipulated. I remember one particular straw buyer, a Chinese guy nicknamed Fu Manchu, with a long beard, who spoke English like he was singing opera but drove a Rolls-Royce and smoked weed like a rapper. He held nearly $7 million in shares for me from a rare earth mining company I had just set up. When the FBI asked, "What do you know about this company?" he shrugged. "I thought it was a cookie company." I burst out laughing when I heard the recording again. Not because it was funny, but because I knew I was living in a world where everyone was lying to themselves. I also needed to move cash overseas. A lot of cash. Millions of dollars wrapped in rubber-banded bundles, hidden in tire wells, suitcases with false bottoms, or sometimes even in baby diapers. The mules were people no one would suspect: housewives, medical students, old men playing golf. We carefully selected them, trained them like spies. No phones, no looking at cameras, no talking to anyone, and absolutely no asking where the money came from. One of the first mules was Nadine, my wife. She didn't know what she was doing. I told her it was necessary documents for partners. She took the briefcase to Geneva, handed it to a man in a gray suit, smiled, and flew back. I hugged her, thanked her, said, "You're my hero." She smiled. I didn't. In my head, there was only one thought: another trip successful. When transporting money by people wasn't fast enough, I used private jets. I hired pilots who knew how to keep quiet. I paid extra to airlines not to log flights. I flew from New York to Monaco, from there to Switzerland, then the Isle of Man, then back to the Bahamas. Each trip like that, I laundered a few million, leaving the dirty dollars somewhere in the Atlantic. But money was only part of it. The real problem was time. I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw myself standing in court, my wife crying, my son looking at me like a stranger. Sleeping pills didn't work. I switched to Quaaludes, then Xanax, then a mixture of both. I started forgetting where I was. Once I drove from home to the office and couldn't remember the way. I sat at my desk, sweating, heart pounding like a drum. But when my employees looked at me, they still saw a king, and I still played the part. Because if I fell, the whole empire would collapse. I was the backbone, the flag, the proof that you could fool the whole world and not get caught. At least for a while. My wedding to Nadine, the Bay Ridge Princess, as I called her, took place in the Caribbean. A tiny island, water clear as a fish's eye. I rented an entire resort, invited famous singers, set up a stage, shot fireworks, and had a pair of white tigers standing on either side of the aisle. Yes, white tigers. I wanted something that would make guests whisper for a year afterward. I wanted the tabloids in Manhattan to go crazy for not being invited. I wanted the world to know that Jordan Belfort had gone from selling seafood door-to-door to marrying a supermodel in paradise. But as I watched Nadine walk towards me, white dress flowing, eyes bright as stage lights, my heart didn't pound. Not because I didn't love her, but because my mind was calculating. How much money was still unlaundered, how many stocks still needed to be pushed, how many contracts were about to expire. I felt like an actor who had forgotten his lines at his own wedding. I smiled, kissed her, and whispered, "We'll have it all." She smiled. I knew full well that all could collapse at any moment. The honeymoon lasted 2 weeks. On my private yacht, which I named Naomi after Nadine's real name, we sailed from the French coast to Greece, then Capri. I hired a Michelin-starred chef, invited artists to perform every night. I wanted Nadine to see that she had chosen the right man. But every time she fell asleep, I would sneak into my cabin, open my laptop, check the market, send encrypted emails, and place sell orders before the US market opened. I didn't know how to live in the moment. I only knew how to run forward like a carriage horse, blinders on, charging into a tunnel with no exit. When I returned to Stratton, I found everything bigger. No one waited for me. They had learned to make money on their own. The office was like a casino, phones ringing, shouts, insane laughter. Someone was smoking weed in the women's restroom. Someone was having sex behind the photocopy machine. I wasn't angry. I felt proud because I had created an environment where morality was a weakness and sales were a religion. But then a name emerged. Steve Madden, a shoe designer from Long Island who had just founded a new company. He asked me to help take his company public. I agreed because I knew he knew nothing about stocks and I knew how to make him a millionaire. Before he even knew what was happening, I bought all the initial public offering shares through my straw buyers. I controlled almost the entire company, but under 58 different names. Then I had my employees make calls to create artificial demand, pushing the stock price up tenfold. When it peaked, I gradually sold through each straw buyer, pulling the money out of the country. A perfect plan. Almost no one suspected. Madden became a millionaire, I became a multimillionaire, and the clients became victims. They didn't know that the stock price rose not because the company was good, but because we had set up an illusory stage, lit the lights, invited the audience, and then pulled the plug the moment the show began. But it was the Steve Madden deal that put me on the FBI's radar. I didn't know it until an agent named Greg started approaching my former employees. He went to the homes of brokers who had quit, asking questions like an old friend. Is Jordan a good guy? Did anyone ever tell you they felt ripped off? Did you keep any documents from your time at Stratton? At first, no one said anything, but I knew everyone had a price and the FBI had time. I called a meeting, ordering everyone to wipe their hard drives, dispose of documents, change phone SIM cards. I said, from now on, everything is verbal. No emails, no faxes. If you want to talk, come in person and whisper. The employees nodded, but I saw the fear in their eyes. The FBI was a different breed. They weren't loud, they didn't make announcements, they just quietly collected. And one day, when you're sleeping soundly, they'll knock on your door not to ask, but to put handcuffs on you. I tried to stay calm, but inside I was falling apart bit by bit. I hired more lawyers than another. I asked them to find loopholes in every line of securities law. I paid them to have lunch with prosecutors, pretending to be professional colleagues. I wanted to know what the FBI knew, how much, from whom, and worst of all, what they were aiming for. In the meantime, Stratton continued to operate as usual, or at least I pretended it did. I still stood in front of the boardroom every morning, coffee cup in hand, shouting slogans, close as if your life depends on it. I was still high on drugs, drinking in the morning, attending meetings with bloodshot eyes. But something had changed. I no longer felt invincible. I felt hunted. I started dealing with the mafia. Not the movie kind of mafia, but white guys from Queens, running underground casinos and loan sharking operations. I needed people to help handle those who might testify against me. I didn't say kill, I said persuade. But I knew how thin the line between those two words was. I met them in deserted restaurant parking lots, sometimes in gym locker rooms. Everything was off the record. I no longer trusted lawyers. I only trusted fear. In one meeting with the mafia, a bald guy with mother, tattooed in Russian on the back of his neck, looked at me and said, "You're smart, but smart doesn't beat the law." I asked, "So what does?" He laughed, shook his head. "Nothing. You can only prolong the game a few more moves." That line haunted me for many nights. I couldn't sleep anymore. I drank until I collapsed. I woke up at 3:00 a.m., went into my son's room, watched him breathe steadily, and thought, one day he'll search my name online. And then what? I wanted to be a hero in my son's eyes, but I knew I was living like a villain, too cleverly written. Madden grew more distant from me. She knew I was hiding something, not the details, but she felt it. Every time I looked into her eyes, I saw something reflected, unspoken contempt. She started sleeping separately, then staying at her mother's house. I tried to win her back with money, with gifts, with trips, but trust, once broken, couldn't be mended with diamond rings. At the same time, I was heavily addicted to Quaaludes, to the point where I no longer knew what was real. I took them to sleep, then took them to wake up. I had an entire desk drawer filled with enough drugs that a hospital would need a license to store them. I scheduled my drug intake like stock trades, on time, the right dose for the right mood. But I no longer had emotions, I only had reflexes. Once, I overdosed in the classroom, eyes rolling back, foaming at the mouth. Employees thought I was joking. They laughed, cheered, thinking I was putting on a show. It wasn't until I fell and hit my head on the table that someone called an ambulance. I woke up in a hospital room, IV in my arm, mouth tasting like metal. The doctor asked, "Do you want to quit?" I looked at him as if he had just asked if I wanted to die right now. I didn't trust anyone, so I started recording every call, with lawyers, with employees, with close friends. I attached voice recorders to my wristwatch, my belt buckle. I stored hundreds of hours of recordings in a safe, just in case someone turned on me. I lived like a spy betraying my own organization. Then the FBI really came, not with armored cars or helicopters, just one agent in a wrinkled shirt and dusty shoes holding a subpoena. He knocked on my door at 7:00 a.m., while I was still in my bathrobe holding a glass of orange juice and vodka. He handed me the paper and said, "You have two choices, cooperate or prepare to face 10 years. I laughed, not because it was funny, but because I had imagined this moment 1,000 times, and now it was here. I only felt relief. I didn't answer the FBI agent. I just shrugged, closed the door, and walked back inside as if I had just declined a party invitation. But in my head, I knew the game had changed rules. From now on, I was no longer the hunter. I was the prey, and they were incredibly patient. I called my lawyer. His voice was flat like a text-to-speech machine. "Don't react, don't answer, don't flinch, you just need to buy time." I asked. "For what?" He replied. "To prepare an exit." I hung up, standing silently in the kitchen. Dawn broke. I heard the lawnmower from my neighbor's house, and I realized that while I was thinking about straw buyers and encrypted transfers, the rest of the world was still living. I increased my drug dosage. I hired more bodyguards. I put up privacy film on my windows. I replaced my entire phone system with one that used private frequencies. I told Nadine that this was just a stressful phase. She asked, "What trouble are we in?" I laughed. "Nothing money can't fix." But even I didn't believe that anymore. I started thinking about escape, opening accounts in Monaco, buying citizenship on the Isle of Man, hiring immigration lawyers in Singapore. I read extradition laws like magazines. I researched how to disappear without a trace. I calculated the money needed to live for 30 years without using my real name. I thought about changing my face, my voice, even my fingerprints. And all the while, Stratton ran like a machine. No one but me knew that the gears were grinding, coming apart. The brokers still shouted, the closing bell still rang. But beneath the shiny veneer were unpatchable cracks. I had hidden it long enough. But every magic trick has its limits, and I was slowly losing control of the monster I had built. I remember a morning meeting. I walked in, intending to deliver my usual speech, but my mouth was dry. I couldn't remember what I was supposed to say. I looked at hundreds of young faces waiting for inspiring words, and I could only utter one sentence: "Be careful." The entire room went silent. Some thought I was playing a trick, others understood. They lowered their heads and turned away. I stood there, speechless. For the first time in years, I had no words left to convince even myself. The FBI tightened its grip. A money mule was arrested at Miami airport. He confessed everything. One of my lawyers was disbarred. My Swiss accounts were frozen. A few former employees called, saying someone was asking them about me. I gave a bitter laugh. "Just tell them the truth. I'm the worst person you've ever met." The person on the other end didn't laugh. I started hearing rumors. "Jordan will betray us. He'll sell out the whole company. He's negotiating with the FBI." The truth was, I hadn't done anything yet. But when someone is too good at lying, no one believes them when they tell the truth. I was living in the trap I had set, and no one was there to cut the wire for me. Finally, I decided to do what I had sworn I would never do: cooperate. I met the FBI in a glass room, 2 agents, 3 lawyers, and a tape recorder. I told them everything, every scheme, every account, every trick, not out of remorse, but because I knew it was the only way to retain something. A piece of freedom, a chance to watch my children grow up without seeing me through prison glass. When I walked out of that room, I was no longer Jordan Belfort, the wolf of Wall Street. I was a man who had killed his own image to survive. The fallout. Everything began to crumble, not from one major event, but from small, trivial things like a persistent cough not severe enough for the hospital, but it kept you from sleeping, from breathing. And then one morning, you just couldn't get up anymore. Before that, even with the FBI lurking, even with straw buyers arrested, even as shell companies were exposed one by one, I still believed I could manage. I was still the man in the room, the one who controlled the money flow, the one my employees looked up to, my wife looked at with concern, my children looked at with eyes that didn't understand what was happening. But I was wrong. I thought I was swimming in a warm pool. In reality, I was sinking in an acid bath. My addiction became something no one could hide anymore. I wasn't getting high for pleasure. I was high because I needed it. Each day started with Xanax. Midday was Quaaludes. Afternoon was Coke. Evening was alcohol. Night was sleeping pills. If I accidentally took the wrong dose, I passed out. If I didn't take them, I trembled, vomited, and my bones ached so much I felt like I was falling into a pot of boiling water. The doctor said, "If you don't stop, your liver will explode." I laughed and said, "Another reason to drink." Nadine began talking to me with her eyes because talking with words was no longer effective. Every word she spoke seemed to touch the last remnants of the human in me. "I married you because you were a dreamer, but now you're dying because of that very dream." I didn't react. I just walked into another room, poured another scotch, drank it down, then smashed something: a painting, a chandelier, or a mirror. I hated looking in mirrors because mirrors don't lie. One time, high on drugs, I climbed into the helicopter parked behind the house, intending to fly to Connecticut to meet a partner. I forgot I hadn't learned to fly. I just knew how to start it, grab the controls, and believe I was invincible. I crashed the helicopter directly into the backyard lawn. No one died, only a rotor blade broke, and Nadine nearly miscarried from sheer terror. That day, she packed her bags, took the kids, and moved to her mother's house. I felt nothing. I just watched her leave, then went inside and turned on the TV. Inside Stratton, the brokers started to crack. No one trusted anyone anymore. Everyone thought someone else was an informant. One guy punched his desk mate, suspecting he was eavesdropping. Another threw a voice recorder into a toilet and flushed it. I met with the team leaders and said, "We still have things under control." They nodded, but their eyes said otherwise. And then there was the first fight in the boardroom, two brokers fighting over a VIP client, yelling at each other, then throwing punches. Blood splattered on the whiteboard. I stood in the middle, shouting, "Stop!" But no one listened. I was no longer the king. I was just a man in an expensive suit standing amidst a pack of hyenas who had smelled rotting flesh. The press began hunting me like a rare animal. Paparazzi photographed me leaving the pharmacy, pale-faced, eyes dark. The New York Post ran a headline, "The King Dethroned." Forbes called me the last icon of a Wall Street burning itself down. I read it and felt nothing. Those articles only reflected a truth I already knew too well. I could no longer hide the rottenness beneath the branded shirt, but I still tried. I started a self-salvation campaign. I hired media experts to repair my image. I gave to charity, appeared at children's hospitals, held a child with cancer for a photo op. I wrote a small book, printed 5,000 copies, distributed for free, True Wealth. I told the press I had changed. But then I went home, opened my safe, took out drugs, and took them in the dark, like someone playing hide-and-seek with myself. Everything inside me at that time operated like a broken clock. It still turned, but no longer told the right time. Every joint inside screamed with fatigue. I knew I needed to stop, but who would stop me? Who would dare pull the handbrake when the car was speeding at 180 kilometers an hour? No lights, no brakes, and no destination. I tried rehab for the first time in Miami, a treatment center that looked like a 4-star resort, where millionaires with ankle monitors meditated and practiced yoga by artificial lotus ponds. I stayed there for 2 weeks, didn't talk to anyone, didn't read newspapers, didn't answer the phone. I just wrote as if trying to cough out a poisonous part of myself. Sometimes I sat in the courtyard, watching the sunrise and thought, maybe I can live differently. But the day I left the center, as I stepped into the limo, someone handed me a chilled bottle of champagne and 2 Quaaludes. I took them, not because I craved them, but because I was afraid of being sober. Sobriety meant facing reality, and I had avoided that my entire life. Nadine came back for the kids, not for me. She gave me a condition. "I'll stay if you stay off drugs." I nodded as always, and as always, I broke my promise. Just 3 days later, I craved Quaaludes so badly that I crawled into the storage room to find a few pills that had fallen on the floor. I swallowed them as if swallowing shame. And the next day, I looked in the mirror again, seeing a man slowly fading away within his own reflection. I started having hallucinations. I saw myself talking to dead people. I heard laughter echoing from turned-off speakers. I looked at my employees and thought they were smiling mockingly. I no longer trusted anyone, no longer controlled anything. I locked my bedroom door, placed a knife under my pillow, installed cameras throughout the house, and told my son it was to protect him from monsters. I didn't say that I was that monster. The FBI gradually became more visible. They no longer hid. They came to the office, took files, questioned employees directly. They sent subpoenas. They called my lawyers. No more hiding. I knew they were about to deliver the final blow. I summoned the board of directors, no longer threatening, just quietly. "We don't have much time." Some nodded, some looked away. I looked at each face. Some I had mentored from day one. Some I had carried home after a drunken night. Now they were about to become witnesses against me. On one particularly bad night, I drove to Jones Beach, parked at the water's edge, headlights shining straight out at the ocean. I opened the door, got out, and walked towards the waves. I wanted to feel the water pulling me, wanted to know if I still knew how to be scared. The cold wind slapped my face, the sand sucked at my feet like cement. I stood there, water up to my waist, then my chest, then my neck. I thought, just bow my head and it's over. But I didn't bow. I turned back, got in the car, turned on the music, and drove home. The next morning, I acted as if nothing had happened. I hugged my kids, kissed my wife, walked the dog. I could play any role, even the role of a normal person. But something in me died that night. The part that hoped to be saved, the part that wanted to beg for mercy, the part that believed everything would be okay. It drifted away with the waves, leaving behind an empty shell of a man, still going to work, still giving orders, still making money, but hollow, like a stranded fish carcass. Then the inevitable day came, a midday call from my lawyer. "Jordan, there's a subpoena from the grand jury. They're about to indict you." I listened, not surprised, just feeling a cold sensation creep up my spine, as if someone had opened a freezer in my chest, and inside was the remaining fear I had buried. I drove home, opened the safe, took out all the documents: tapes, secret notes, fake contracts, lists of straw buyers, completed and pending deals. I stuffed everything into a leather bag, locked it, and took it down to the basement. There was a secure cabinet buried under the floor, only I knew the code. I put everything in, closed it, and wondered, how well hidden is safe enough? Nadine saw me and asked, "What's wrong?" I replied, "Just another investigation." She didn't ask further. She was used to evasive answers. I knew she feared the truth, and I feared the lies that had become routine. That night, I lay in bed, unable to touch sleep. I thought about the brokers struggling with the calling scripts I had written, about the cold calls that made people lose their fortunes, about old men and women selling their homes to buy strategic stocks that were actually junk. I used to laugh when I told those stories. Now, I felt sick to my stomach. The next morning, I woke up early, made a cup of unsweetened coffee, opened the window, and looked out at the yard. My dog was digging in the grass. I thought, even it is trying to hide something, and I burst out laughing. A soundless laugh, just a vibration in my chest. A kind of laugh from someone who knows the ending has been scheduled. I went to the office and called Danny, my right-hand man, into my room. I said, "We're running out of time. You should prepare yourself." He asked, "What are you going to do?" I said, temporarily stepping back, leaving Stratton taking a break. He looked stunned, as if he'd just been slapped with $1 million bill. He didn't understand, and I didn't want to explain that I was trying to do the right thing for the first time when it was already too late. I sent an email to the executive board announcing my resignation as chairman. The content was concise, no tears, no excuses. I said I needed to rebalance my life. A cliché I used to scoff at, now a cloak covering wounds I dared not look at. But like everything I had touched, this decision also turned into chaos. After I left, the stock prices of the companies Stratton had pushed began to plummet. Clients called with complaints, employees were flustered, the media sniffed out something abnormal, and the FBI, they knew they had won a big move. I thought I would feel relieved, but instead I felt lost. No more office, no more bright lights, no more ringing closing bells, no more 9:00 a.m. meetings where I stood above like a preacher. I sat at home, turned on the TV, not knowing what to watch, opened the fridge, not feeling hungry. Opened my computer, no emails that really needed answering. Nadine suggested a vacation. I agreed. We went to St. Bart's, an expensive island where people wore bikinis like office uniforms. I rented a beachfront villa, hired a private chef, even a yoga instructor for Nadine. She smiled more, and I drank more. One evening, drunk, I stood on the balcony watching the waves. I thought, I wish I had never known money. A thought I didn't dare share with anyone because it sounded like a lie. I knew if I had the chance to start over, I would still do everything the same. Except I would scam more subtly. The vacation ended earlier than expected. Not because we ran out of money, but because I couldn't stand the feeling of relaxation. No phone calls, no market open, no one waiting for me to make decisions. I was like an animal whose roar had been cut off surviving, but no longer myself. Back in New York, I tried to regain a sense of control with familiar things: calling escorts, underground parties on the Upper East Side, playing golf with tycoons sitting on untraceable fortunes. But it all felt bland. No high was strong enough to make me forget the name, grand jury, swirling around my head like cigarette smoke. And then Nadine asked for a divorce. No tears, no fighting, no smashing things. Just one morning she placed her teacup on the table, looked straight into my eyes and said, "I've had enough." I asked, "Can't you wait a few more months?" She replied, "I've waited for years." She pulled a stack of papers from her purse. a draft of the divorce petition, neat and clean, as if it were a project she had prepared for a long time. I didn't react, didn't scream, didn't beg. I just nodded, then turned away. I walked into my study, locked the door, pulled a bottle of Beaujolais from the drawer, took a gulp, and thought, so this is it. But I knew the end was never that clean. I refused to leave the house. Although my lawyer advised me to move out to reduce legal pressure, I clung on. Not because I loved the house, I just couldn't stand the thought of leaving the place that had once been proof that I had won. I started sleeping on the sofa. I ate haphazardly, didn't shave, didn't change clothes. I became a living ghost in the mansion that had once been the fortress of my dream of success. Nadine said nothing. She just asked me not to do anything stupid. But stupidity was my instinct then. One night, high on drugs, I took my daughter Chandler out of the house. I told her we were going on an adventure. In reality, I had no idea what I was doing. I just wanted to hold onto a small part of my life that was falling apart. The police found me a few hours later. Car parked on the side of the road. My daughter asleep in the back seat and me slumped over the steering wheel, mouth full of foam from the drugs. Luckily, no accident. Luckily, no one died. But I knew this time it was truly over. Nadine filed an emergency order. The court issued a restraining order against me. I had to leave the house within 3 days. I rented a small apartment looking out at a gray brick wall. No one greeted me in the morning, no one called me boss. I sat in the living room, TV on with no sound, and thought, why am I still alive? The FBI sent official notification. I would be indicted. Charges included securities fraud, money laundering, conspiracy to manipulate the market. I looked at the list of accusations as if looking at a bill after a long meal. I had ordered so many dishes I couldn't remember what I had eaten. My lawyers advised me to plead guilty. I hesitated. But when they offered the deal 20 years in prison if I went to trial, or 5 years if I fully cooperated, I understood the only choice left was surrender. I signed the paper, a short stroke of a pen that ended nearly a decade of living like a myth. A few days later, I picked up the phone and called the FBI agent. He answered. I said, "I'm ready." He replied, "So are we." When I hung up, I felt something I had never felt throughout my time as the Wolf of Wall Street, lightness. Not because I was at peace, but because I no longer had to pretend. I didn't go to prison immediately after signing the plea agreement. They gave me time to prepare. A former prisoner allowed to sort out his belongings before being taken away. I lived in that strange lull, no longer the Wolf of Wall Street, but not yet a convict. A buffer between two worlds where every morning I woke up, I didn't know what to call myself. I rented a small place in Manhasset. No maid, no driver, no doorman, just me. An old spring bed and a scratched mirror hanging loosely on the wall. I cleaned every day. Not because I liked cleanliness, but because I needed something to do. I cooked with a microwave, ate off plastic plates, drank from paper cups. Some nights I sat alone in the kitchen, fluorescent lights on, eating cup noodles and thinking, is this a lesson or is this the end? Occasionally, I drove to visit the kids at Nadine's house, under the supervision of lawyers from both sides. Chandler hugged me, saying, "Dad, you're so thin." Carter, the child I hadn't really got to know yet, just looked at me, not smiling. I played with them for an hour or two, then got in my car and cried. Not because I missed them, but because I knew a part of me could never go back to being a normal father. I started meeting with prosecutors on schedule. Each meeting was a mental dissection. They asked, I answered. They replayed old recordings, the pump and dump calls, the withdrawal orders, the stock manipulation schemes I once thought no one knew about. I sat there, head bowed, nodding like a student caught cheating. They asked me to name the others, accomplices, co-conspirators, legal advisors, overseas partners. I knew the game. If I stayed silent, I got 10 years. If I talked, I got 5. I chose 5. 6 months later, they asked me to wear a wire to help complete the investigation file. I hesitated but then agreed, not out of loyalty to the law. I was simply too tired to resist. The feeling of wearing a wire and talking to people I had eaten and slept with, people who had saved me from addiction, people who had helped me hide money, was a betrayal I couldn't forgive myself for. I told myself, you're just doing this to survive. But I knew this survival came at the cost of something dying inside me. Once I met Danny, my closest friend, my right-hand man. He asked, "What's that you're wearing on your belt?" I laughed. "A pedometer." He raised an eyebrow and fell silent. He knew, and I knew he knew. We drank beer, talked like old times, but nothing was old anymore. When we parted, he only shook my hand, no hug, and I understood we wouldn't meet again. During that time, I started writing. Not to publish, just to keep my mind from spiraling. I wrote about Wall Street, about the early days, about the feeling of calling to scam a doctor into buying junk stocks. I wrote as if I was dissecting myself, and for the first time, I didn't rationalize. I wrote exactly what I had done, without embellishment, without pretense. Each page was a layer of skin peeled away. My lawyer read it and said, "If you change it a bit, it could become a book." I asked, who would want to read a story about a jerk who scammed an entire country? He shrugged. People prefer hearing stories from bad guys than sermons from good guys. That line haunted me for weeks. I started taking writing seriously. Every morning I woke up, sat at my desk, made a weak cup of coffee, opened my laptop and wrote. No editing, no rereading, just writing as a way to unburden myself or as a form of self-punishment. I recounted every scheme, every trick, every long night out of control, every sophisticated lie. The early pages were full of sarcasm and arrogance, but as I went on, the tone became more somber, as if I myself was tired of recounting the same tragedy again and again. My lawyer sent the manuscript to a literary agent. A few weeks later, I received feedback from a major publisher. They said, "If you tell it straight, without embellishment, this will be the book that makes Wall Street look at itself." I don't know if they were telling the truth or just smelled money, but I agreed to publish it. Not to clear my name, but to record it. Because if I didn't tell my story myself, others would, and I didn't trust any of them. The day my sentence was officially announced, I stood before the court, wearing a dark suit, cleanly shaved, my gaze not lowered as in movies. I looked straight at the judge and said, "I have defrauded, manipulated, and betrayed the trust of thousands of people. I deserve to be punished." I didn't wait for applause, and of course, no one did. The sentence was 22 months in prison, lighter than the maximum because I had cooperated, because I had betrayed those who had helped me build the empire. I felt no joy, only emptiness. The day before entering prison, I met Nadine again. She came not for me, but for our children. She brought Chandler, who is older now, spoke clearly, and asked many questions. The little girl looked at me and asked, "Where are you going, Dad?" I replied, "To study for a long course." She didn't ask more. I thought she was smarter than I gave her credit for. In the car to the airport, because the prison was in another state, I remained silent the whole way. No thoughts, no remorse, no trembling. Just a strange feeling. For the first time in my life, I had nothing to do, no one to scam, no plan to orchestrate. I was a naked man, stepping into a place where money couldn't buy respect. Prison wasn't what I imagined. Not iron bars, dark cells, rapists. I was held in a low-security facility, the kind for white-collar criminals. A room for 3 with a TV, a basketball court, a library. I played tennis, read books, continued writing the manuscript for my memoir. A few fellow inmates recognized me. They called me the Wolf. One guy wanted me to teach him how to scam people without getting caught. I said, "I got caught, didn't I?" He replied, "But you're better than most." I didn't know if that was a compliment or an insult. In prison, I wrote more than I did when I was free. I wrote as if each word was a paving stone on the road back to humanity. I wrote to remember that I had once been human, and maybe, just maybe, there was still a chance to start over. A few months later, I received a letter from someone I had scammed. A doctor from Boston who had lost over $300,000 because of the stocks I sold. He wrote, "I hate you, but if you truly want to atone, teach others not to be like you." I folded the letter, put it in my pocket, didn't reply. But that sentence haunted me for the rest of my sentence. I was released from prison on an autumn morning. No one to pick me up, no fanfare, no cameras, no rose petals lining the way. Just a bag of belongings, an old pair of shoes, and a paper confirming I had served my time. I stood outside the prison gates, took a deep breath, and thought, now what? I rented a small apartment near the beach. Every morning I walked along the sand, watching people do yoga, jog, walk their dogs. They didn't know who I was, no one pointed, no one asked me what stocks I was playing. I became invisible, and strangely, that made me feel light. I called Nadine, asking if the kids could visit over the weekend. She hesitated, then agreed. When Chandler and Carter walked into the apartment, I felt like the world was being pieced back together, little by little. They looked around and asked, "Dad, do you live here?" I smiled and replied, "Yes, for now." I didn't say, because Dad lost everything, because I didn't want my downfall to be their legacy. I tried to rebuild not from stocks but from words. I started accepting speaking invitations. At first, small classes, then financial conferences, then universities. I recounted my life without embellishment, without self-justification. I talked about greed, about deceit, about how I manipulated others and myself. Once, a student asked, "If you could do it again, would you choose a different path?" I replied, "I would still choose Wall Street, but I would sell the truth, not illusions." My first book, The Wolf of Wall Street, the name I once found shameful, now became a bestseller. Hollywood came calling. A famous director called me. "Jordan, we want to bring your story to the big screen." I was silent, then agreed. Not for the money, but because I knew if I didn't tell it, others would distort it, and I had been distorted enough. I worked with the film crew, recounting every detail, every scene, every line of dialogue. I met Leonardo, who would play me. He asked, "Do you have any regrets?" I replied, "Yes, but that doesn't fix anything, so I choose to tell the story again, so that at least someone else doesn't get caught in the trap I once set." The movie was a success. I was interviewed on every TV channel. People called me an inspirational speaker. I laughed. Inspirational for what? A scammer, a drug addict, a man who lost his kids, lost his wife. Someone who touched the bottom of morality, now an inspirational speaker. But then I thought, if I could do something right, even just once, then perhaps it wasn't too late. I started rebuilding my life slowly, responsibly. I wasn't as rich as before, but I had enough to live on. I didn't have a yacht, but I had an old car that worked. I didn't have a mansion, but I had a clean, warm apartment, and most importantly, I could look back at the past without flinching. I still taught others sales, but I taught the truth. I said, "Don't sell dreams, sell solutions. Don't use fear to pressure, use understanding to persuade." Many asked, "How do I know when I've crossed the line?" I answered, "When you have to start lying to yourself, you've already crossed the line." I met some old acquaintances again. Some forgave me, some didn't. I didn't blame them, I just quietly nodded. I understood that trust wasn't something you could beg for, it had to be rebuilt. And there are some bridges, no matter how hard you try, that no longer have a shore on the other side to connect to. One morning, I woke up, made coffee, opened the window, and realized I no longer held any grudge against life. No anger at Wall Street, no hatred for prison, no resentment towards my accusers, and no self-pity anymore. It was a strange feeling, light as the wind and so real it scared me. Because when you let go of everything, even emotions about yourself, what is left? The answer came from Chandler, my daughter. That day, she visited with her brother. She asked, "Dad, do you want to come see me sing?" I replied, "Of course." And that evening, for the first time in years, I sat in a small auditorium, watching my daughter stand on stage and sing a simple nursery rhyme. I didn't think about stocks, didn't think about prison, didn't think about Steve Madden or straw buyers or the FBI in their blue shirts. I just thought, this is the reward. Not money, not power, but a moment as simple and pure as fresh water. After the performance, my daughter ran to hug me. She didn't ask about the past, she just said, "I'm happy you came." And for the first time in many years, I felt forgiven. Not by the law, but by the child I had missed during those long years of drugs and deceit. Finally, I continued writing, not because I wanted fame, but because I knew my story, dark and full of flaws, could be a reverse mirror for someone standing on the edge of an abyss. I don't teach how to get rich. I teach how to survive after destroying everything you once loved. I don't promise anything beautiful. I just recount what's real, and I hope that in that truth, someone will find a different path for themselves. Today, when I stand on stage facing hundreds of people who want to crack the code of success, I say something I once despised. Be honest. Not for morality, but because it is the only sustainable strategy. Some laugh, some don't believe. I don't try to convince them. I just tell my story as I am doing with you. Because I know that in this turbulent world, a true story might be the only thing that makes people stop and think, I was a wolf. I was a legend. I had everything, then lost everything. And now I'm just a man trying to live decently for the rest of my days. That's the price, and I've paid it.